can I invite you to a Filò? Filò means the gathering to tell stories. This is a Welsh language novel, but that's not a Welsh language title. That's Soligesi, the language or dialect from, well, Pieve di Soligo as far as I'm concerned, where the anchor is, but the northern part of Veneto in Italy. And the reason why I have a foreign title for this Welsh language novel is that it is authentic to the way Welsh is spoken or the way encounter happens in this novel. So the meaning of the word is to gather in places of warmth. Think before the time we had television, we would gather to tell stories of an evening, to share each other's company. So by the fireside or even in the cowshed to share physical warmth. And some people might recognize the title Filò also from a rather famous poem by Andrea Zonzotto, also from Pieve di Soligo. So I'll come to why this particular mix of cultures in a while, but here is some of the Welsh introduction. Nid oeddem yn gofyn am hapusrwydd, pero roedden nhw ar y tu allan yn deud fod haul yn pelydru o'n Clystini. Dyna di arwydd o hapusrwydd mewn dyn, haul yn pelydru o bob twll o'i gorff. Roedd angen golau o rwle ar y llong. Fel arall byddai'r hold lle roedden ni fel bol buwch, a ninnau'n canu bob tro roedd sŵn bom arall o'r tu allan. Un eldra, fa ddiawl sydd wedi chwdu rwan. Ac yna un arall, splashes a plenty water, ond dim un ohonom yn cael ein glychu. Efallai mae nhw oedd yn cael ei glychu, ein gelynion ar y dec. Mae'n well bod yn garcharor nac yn goncwerwr mewn rhai rhyfeloedd, Signore Dio. So the background to how this novel came about is something very close to my heart, I think, to the heart of many people in my family. Way back in 1988, my dad bought a caravan and took us traipsing through Europe to find people who were important to him and we knew nothing about. And they were the families of Italian prisoners of war who had been billeted in Wales during the Second World War, and three of which were very close to our family: Piero Crossato, Piero Busetti and Vittore Carino. Piero Busetti was from Pieve di Soligo, and so I've anchored my story in at least a place that I know well, and also in more or less in the Prosecco Triangle, so some people might recognize it more as being part of that region of Italy. And this extended family grew, and I was interested in the spaces of encounter, what it meant for these group of very young Italians to arrive in a foreign country, not really understanding each other, all speaking very different dialects, arriving maybe with a smattering of English, some of them, but being housed eventually in farms among people who spoke Welsh, not Italian, and not dialect, and not English. And what really was the language of encounter and engagement, what misunderstandings, what mistakes, and what I found through living similar experiences is that, of course, you use your body more and you use the things around you. And I've long been interested in the habits that we have with land, and of course that led me to the language of land and the language of using land. And of course they would have been farming and engaging with the land quite directly. So what we have is a relationship built on activity and physical engagement and land in particular, flowers, the tools of the land and the food that land can provide, especially in times of war. Also something that interested me is that in 2000 I was living quite a bit in Italy, as was my brother at the time, and our Welsh was peppered with Italian and other languages that maybe people in the same group were speaking. It was authentic, but it was impure. And I wanted to experiment what might happen if I allowed myself to give this authentic but impure, very mixed language to characters on the page. So I have Guido, the main Italian protagonist, who arrives with 11 other prisoners of war in the same cabin in a ship from Alexandria to Glasgow, and then from Glasgow on trains to Wales after El Alamein, and they remain comrades for the duration of their time in Wales. And this is a short chapter when they're in Glasgow in the prison camp, and they've just been given pencils to write home for the first time, and Guido does something else with his pencil. With that pencil, I wrote something else. I started a sort of diary. I started like this. Ricordi e racconti scritti per chi tanto amo. I could have written Pina's name and greeted her directly. Ricordi e racconti per Pina. Memories and histories written for the one I love. Somehow that would have destroyed her privacy, so I left her out. It was a letter to someone, to a vague someone who didn't know my history. Everyone had their Pina. I thought that if I could write a little bit like that nobody would censure my words, that my Pina in the future could spend some time with that part of me that was prisoner. Stupido. That's what it was. Every time I wrote something, it was confiscated or stolen. Era così. Before leaving Egypt, that's how it was. I'd written the history of the battle, the prison, day by day, and that ended up in the hands of an Anzac. Then in Glasgow, a raid one morning before we came to our senses properly, they took Pina's words from me, and some words of a manifesto Rodolfo had been scribbling and keeping under his mattress. I was better off telling the story to the wind at Wall. It had a better chance of reaching home or going from one country to another. Nobody could censure voice. They say, don't they, that when we tell a story, first of all, we do it to amuse ourselves. It doesn't always matter who is listening, nor if anybody is listening at all. The wind. Solo il vento. I'm only povero e ignorante, but that's what I believe. Maybe the story is nothing but noise like zanzare in someone's ear. I gave up writing. I started drawing. Doodling, really. Playing around with pencils to pass the time. An attacaveste weed to start. The one that sticks to clothes. The best plant ever for us when we were kids. I'd throw it at my sisters when they turned their backs, but never at Mama. Attacaveste that had attaccare to the Nissen hut wall, penciled there. They started with a line, which turned into the faintest leaf, which turned into a star of leaves like you'd get with that weed, then a growing to a full plant. Niente importante, I would say. Rodolfo watched me and said nothing. A boy from Firenze, too, from one star of leaves to a long, long stem over the uneven surface of the Nissen hut, right to the ceiling and my pencil always scratching. At the ceiling, I stopped. I did it for the pleasure of each line growing from the previous line, for the silence, for Rodolfo's silent watching and that Florentine, and for the sleep afterwards, as I watched the attacaveste going to the top of the hut. Mama would make tea with that plant when we were kids, especially around Ferragosto when it was unbearably hot. She'd stuff a knot into it, into a saucepan with hot water before squeezing it through a cloth. That drink cooled flesh, she said. We'd have preferred a hot water bottle in Glasgow, but all I had was my drawing of the attacaveste. Other drawings too, after that. Primula, with no sugar to make marmelata of them, no oil to make salsa. So I drew them and ate them raw from the field, leaves and flowers like sweets. I left the edges of that camp empty by nightfall, and the primula returned by morning each day. Lami purpureo, Pietro's favourite in a salad. He loved heart-shaped things, like me. Dente di leone, my friend, my faithful flower, more tender and gradevole than tarassaco, although so similar. Tooth of lion, dandelion, I drew that behind the legs of my bed where Osvaldo had seen his god, his spider, in a dream. I prefer to think of lion's teeth there. So eventually these young men, boys, they make their way to Wales, of course. And the part of my story that's inevitable is that they also make their way back home. There were certain shapes that I sort of had to stick to. What fascinated me was the how and why and what happened in the space I was given. And of course, the encounter is going to hold some tension. All the sort of intense colours of experience, I think. And so I'd like to move on to a short reading where he goes on an adventure, breaking all the rules as a prisoner with his boss. Other times they said we were bachgen drwg, naughty. They wanted to know us as storytellers, as workers, but some of us were more than that. We were the prodigal son, and then out of the blue, bad. On Nantrion on Verma, there was a car. Lusso. What's that again? Luxury, pure luxury. But it wouldn't start, that car, so I had to run downhill for 50 yards before it kicked and started by picking up speed. Then I had to jump into the seat by Boss Evan's side while the car was still moving, speeding. It was almost impossible, just hoping I wouldn't lose a foot or worse. Then it was good Boss and bachgen drwg. The joke between us, always on a scappatello with his Italiano, Boss Evan loved thinking of himself that way, so long as nobody in power got wind of it. After jumping in, he'd noticed that the lights were on the blink on his beloved car. He shouted then, "Get the flunch lamp, shine it out the window." That's how we'd go to the pub every month or two. Golden days when people did what they shouldn't, even the free people. Things we'd never dream of doing now. The POWs weren't supposed to go to pubs. We'd meet outside instead. And our pint there sitting in the car on cold nights until the cold reached our marrow bones and we had to keep warm by running races. We were invisible there. Run, rabbit, run, coming out from underneath the pub door and reaching us outdoors. Their glad, mad crows would crow up to the sky every time we sang, especially if Organ happened to be with us, sheltering in the car park. The sun would disappear, too, behind a row of houses all pink and orange. There the street was perfectly bellissimo. We'd drink and then run the length of the empty street to keep warm, prisoners free on their street, the earth lumpy with small stones, slippery slabs. But still we ran in our nail boots past the primary school and turned back by the closed flower shop and laughed with cold beer in our bellies, up the high street, down the narrow streets, found the way back and made sure nobody saw we were missing. We knew the place as good as our boss did, even in the dark. And then we'd come home to the old Ford and the warmth of singing, "Run, run, don't give the farmer his fun, fun, fun." That's what we had to do. Run, 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 all the way home after that, laughing, the flash lamp with the blackout mask on it in case. A mad zigzag sort of drive, of course, but that's how things were. Era così. Adventure with a Welshman without our friends. Sometimes we'd keep the story to ourselves too. Just Boss Evans and me, bachgen drwg in the same useless car. Back home, I'd give him weak tea on a stool in the kitchen when he insisted he wanted just a little whiskey before bed. He was none the wiser. After that, Morfydd and Gwyneth would step around us like rabbits about the house, and Boss Evan wouldn't show any interest in his antics like that for a month or two. So to leave you, I'm going to come back to our Guido, our guide, the one who speaks almost like the leader of a choir, representing not just the other 11 in that cabin in the ship on the way, but all of the prisoners perhaps, or even more. And he says, of Filò and this idea of gathering and telling stories. We told stories, one after the other, to resurrect love for life. And we did it too. Then it was time to enjoy a good argument.